All right, hi guys. Today we're going to be going through your chapter 13, which is on life in the ocean. I kind of talked about it last week. This is going to be your precursor chapter into essentially everything we're going to talk about in the second semester. So we're going to start moving into the animals that live in the ocean now that we've kind of come to understand some of the more physical aspects of the ocean itself. So we're going to go from smallest to largest, so all the way from teeny tiny plankton all the way up to our big blue whales. But before we can really start breaking down the different species of life in the ocean, we have to know where it comes from. And so this chapter is going to be a little bit all over the place because most of this information is going to be a little bit of a repeat from what you've learned in biology already. So we're just going to kind of cover the main points. We're going to go over evolution. We're going to go over our food chains. So we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to go ahead and talk about is photosynthesis. Now, this is a word I know every single one of you know because we've been talking about photosynthesis since you were in like first grade. So, of course, most of the energy used by marine organisms to make food comes from the sun. That's just like anywhere else on Earth. That is always going to be our primary source of energy. Now, this is going to be used by producers. We all remember what producers are. These are going to be the very bottom of your food pyramid. They are going to convert the sun's energy into that food energy that is then used by consumers. Now, a similar process that we didn't talk about quite as much, but you should remember it from biology, is going to be chemosynthesis. Now, chemosynthesis is very similar to photosynthesis, except that it's happening without the sun. Instead, what's happening is around that producer, chemicals are being released that producer can then take into their bodies and use those inorganic molecules in its environment to create that food energy. A good example of this in the ocean is going to be some of the species that live near hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are essentially vents at the bottom of the ocean that are releasing a lot of very hot chemicals into the water. Those species obviously are very, very deep, so they don't have sunlight. So instead, they take these chemicals, the sulfur, carbon dioxide, and they're using that to convert it into energy that is then being consumed by consumers down the food chain. So photosynthesis and chemosynthesis are definitely going to be big parts of where our energy comes from. So this again is just a little bit of an illustration. We all know how the food chain works. We start with the sun. That light energy goes to our producers. In the ocean most of the time, we're going to see this being seaweed, algae, bacteria, those planktonic creatures. And then that chemical energy is going to go into consumers. So small fish to medium fish to bigger fish. That's how we all know it works. Now we have to remember that through these living systems, after each step, that energy is going to degrade. And what I mean by that is the sun gives off a ton of energy, so your producers have a ton of energy. Then when they're consumed, it gets a little less. And then when the next one consumes it, it's a little less. So we'll look at this here in just a little bit. Now, most of the productivity in our oceans that comes from this photosynthesis is going to happen near the top of the ocean. This should make sense because that's where the most sunlight is going to penetrate. If we think back to the chapter that we just finished, we talked about how different light rays can actually penetrate into the water at different depths. Remember, we said that red can only get so deep. Blue is obviously going to be the one that can get the most deep. And then after a certain point, obviously, no light penetrates at all. So this is going to be called the euphotic zone. This is going to be where you find a lot of those tropical regions of the ocean. So to about 230 feet deep, that's going to be where the most photosynthesis is going to occur, and also, of course, that clear line of vision in our ocean waters. Now, below that euphotic zone is going to be called the dysphotic zone. There's very little sunlight here for photosynthesis. In some cases, you're going to have a little bit of productivity, but not nearly as much. This is going to be all the way down 600 meters or 2,000 feet. So this is definitely going to be where there's just minimal vision, very little productivity happening. And then, of course, at the very bottom of the ocean is going to be your aphotic zone, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is going to be that vast area of the bottom of the ocean that sunlight is never actually going to be able to penetrate. So this is going to be where that chemosynthesis is all they can rely on because there's no sunlight to do photosynthesis. All right, so with that being said, we're going to go through some terms really quickly that, again, you should be familiar with from biology. Autotrophs, we all know that autotrophs are going to be those organisms that automatically create their own food. These are going to be your producers. These are going to be the things that are using the sun's energy. Heterotrophs, these are going to be up that food pyramid a bit. These are going to be organisms that consume other organisms, whether it be seaweed, other fish, whatever the case may be, and they use those organisms for their energy. The trophic pyramid, which is what we're going to look at here in just a second, this is going to be a model of who describes who. Of course, there's different things, food webs, food chains. I like to use the pyramid just because you can physically see a reduction in the energy as it's transversed from one level to the next. Primary conducers, these are going to be organisms that eat other organisms. Secondary is exactly what it sounds like. Secondary eats primary, and then tertiary or top consumers eat the next. Now with an energy pyramid, the one you typically will see as an example and the one that'll be in the assignment you have at the end of the week are typically about 5-6 levels, but in reality, those energy pyramids can go on for many levels. So this is just easiest for us to kind of look at because we can measure it, but in reality, an energy pyramid can have secondary, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, etc. All right, so this is an example of the trophic pyramid. And this one actually comes out of the textbook. So I do like to use this one. I know I don't use a whole lot of the textbook. So this is essentially going to be a pyramid that is made up of biomass. Now biomass is going to be the amount of energy measured in joules that we are actually transferring from one organism to the next. So at the very bottom, you have your primary producers, you have your producers, you have your primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and then your top consumers. So starting from the bottom, we have an example here as being phytoplankton. These are going to be your primary producers. These are going to be very teeny tiny organisms, typically that are on the surface of the water that are converting that sunlight from photosynthesis into energy. Now, these organisms, because they are doing photosynthesis, are going to have a lot of that energy, a lot of those joules coming from them because they don't have any kind of degradation from what they're producing. So the example here gives us that they are creating 10,000 kilograms of those joules. Now moving up, those phytoplankton are eaten by zooplankton. That's going to be your primary consumer. Now your primary consumer, now that we've moved up a level, we've gone from 10,000 to 1,000. So you can see that has degraded very rapidly. Now that zooplankton is then going to be eaten by small fish. These are going to be your little bit larger consumer, your secondary consumer. They're going to drop from 1,000 to 100 kilograms of that energy. And then again, moving from small fish to our mid-sized fish, this is going to drop 100 to 10. And then all the way to that very top consumer, this is going to drop it all the way down to a kilogram apiece. So we've now gone from 10,000 kilograms of energy down to a single kilogram of energy. Now, it's a good example of this is going to be tuna that they have here. Tuna is considered a sport fish. They're typically very large, very fast. They require a lot of energy. So because they're getting such a degraded food source by consuming these mid-sized fish that already don't have a whole lot of kilograms of energy, they're going to have to make up for that by eating quite a bit because they're going to have to compensate for what they're not getting. If tuna ate phytoplankton, then they'd be getting a ton of energy, but obviously that's not the case. So the higher you move up the food chain, you're getting less energy, so you have to compensate for that by eating more, which tends to lead to bigger animals. All right, so moving away from the food chain a little bit, we're going to get into some of the elements that have created these biogeochemical cycles. Big word, I know, but you break it down, it's very easy. Bio meaning life, geo meaning earth, and chemical. So these are going to be the cycles that are essentially going to make up what is surfacing through our world. So this is going to be very similar to that water cycle we just finished. This is going to be your carbon cycle, your nitrogen cycle. So these are going to usually contain the four main elements that are going to build life itself. So carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. So I'm just going to go through really quickly. Again, this chapter is pretty much a review, some of these important biogeochemical cycles and how they are so important to our oceans. So the carbon cycle, of course, the carbon cycle is going to be our largest cycle on Earth. It's going to be present in all organic molecules. This, of course, is going to be incredibly important for the ocean just as it is on land. Your nitrogen cycle, which I'll talk a little bit more, is not as familiar. You probably didn't cover this quite so much in biology. This is going to be the cycle that really is going to affect living things more so the environment, because it's going to be found in a lot of our oceans environments, proteins and the nucleic acids found in those living things. So this is going to be a cycle that's very heavy inside the body rather than the environment. And then the phosphorus and silicone and the iron and trace metals, these again, much smaller cycles, but still pretty important to fish in the sea specifically. So like I said, the carbon cycle, this is going to be the Earth's largest cycle, even more so than our water cycle. So carbon dioxide is dissolved into seawater. It is the source of carbon atoms that is going to be assembled by food. So whenever we have any kind of photosynthesizer or chemosynthesizer, that carbon cycle is going to be what is used to assemble that food into the energy that it releases whenever it's consumed by the consumer. So you can see an example of the carbon cycle here, how it is moving through the ocean is going to be typically found in a combination of respiration and decomposition, and then is going to be released back into the atmosphere. So definitely a big part of the atmosphere to ocean relationship. Now, nitrogen cycle is a little bit different because in the ocean, it plays a role that isn't necessarily a positive role in some levels. So nitrogen is necessary in the ocean because the bacteria that is naturally in our ocean waters, that's typically floating on the surface, that bacteria is actually going to fix a lot of the nitrogen. And what I mean by that is we as humans and all other living things on Earth need nitrogen because it's an essential element for the proteins in our body, for our DNA, for all the biochemicals that are making our day-to-day functions work. Nitrogen is just part of that process. So what happens is as this nitrogen is cycling through the atmosphere, it's actually going to go through those bacteria in the ocean and be fixed so that that can then be transferred to living organisms by connecting with those bacteria and be usable in our bodies. Now, the negative side of that is that too much nitrogen fixation can actually cause issues in the ocean. Runoff is a good example of this. Runoff is essentially where water that is on land that is picking up extra chemicals, extra nitrogen, is running off into the ocean. So then all that bacteria is fixing extra that it doesn't need to be fixing. And then this can actually cause a lot of issues in that photic zone up top. If you've ever heard of a HBA, which is a harmful algae bloom, we get them here in Florida every 3-4 years or so. Essentially what happens is we have a lot of agriculture here in Florida. So that means farmers using pesticides and different chemicals. And then that water is running off from our aquifer into the oceans. And so all those extra chemicals and all that extra nitrogen are then being soaked up by that bacteria in the ocean. And it causes this bloom of what is normally a steady amount of bacteria on the top of the ocean. And now all of a sudden it's got all these extra resources that it could just absolutely overwhelm that area of the ocean. And now the fish that are underneath it are dying. There's so much algae and so much bacteria that there's not enough oxygen to keep up with every other living thing in the ocean. So if you look up a harmful algae bloom, you can see it usually will turn the ocean green, sometimes orange, sometimes even red. So these are pretty prominent, like I said, in the Gulf of Mexico here. About every 3 or 4 years, we usually have a pretty significant bloom. Typically when Lake Okeechobee or any area of the Everglades tends to flood and that rushes off into the ocean, then we see a lot of these nitrogen cycles overwhelming our saltwater cycles. Now, phosphorus and silicone, again, these are some of the smaller cycles that you're probably not as familiar with from biology. just because they tend to be a little more significant to very specific parts of life, so they're not as thoroughly covered. So phosphorus is going to be an essential part of the energy transporting compounds used by our life forms. So a lot of the cycle in its relationship to the ocean actually falls deep down in the seabed. So our seabed is covered, of course, with sediment, whether it be dirt, silt, whatever the case may be, rock. And that phosphorus, whenever a animal, plant, whatever it happens to be, dies, will release a lot of that phosphorus that'll sink to the bottom of the ocean. It then sits with that sediment, and then typically is actually subducted by the tectonic forces, which y'all should know plenty about subduction at this point. Excuse me. And those subduction zones are actually going to take that phosphorus down with them. And then years and years later, it'll return to the surface through volcanic eruptions. Because remember, when that subducting plate goes under, it melts, it comes up through a volcano. So this is how it's released back into the atmosphere. So that's where phosphorus and silicone kind of intermingle with all of that tectonic activity that's happening at our ocean floor. All right. Now we're going to kind of talk about some of the factors that are going to influence the success of marine organisms. Now this is going to come into play. We're going to talk about evolution here in just a bit. So these things are definitely going to make a difference on how successful or unsuccessful an animal is as they go through their evolutionary process. So the first one being a physical factor. So a physical factor is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to be any aspect of the physical environment that affects the organism. This can be the temperature of the water, how much salt is in the water, or is it a coral reef, or is it a kelp forest? So these are going to be physical things that are actually going to affect the fish in the ocean. Biological factors, again, exactly what it sounds like. This is going to be any aspect of the living environment that affects organisms. So how many other fish are living there? Is there enough of a food source? These are going to be things that are also living but can still affect your species. And then you have limiting factors. These are going to tie in both physical and biological. So a limiting factor is something that in the right quantities is good. So for example, oxygen. Enough oxygen, good thing. But a limiting factor can also be something that is harmful if it's present in quantities that are too large or too small. So if you have a coral reef with all these fish, then it's presumed that the water has enough oxygen to sustain all of these animals. But if you don't, then obviously they're going to start dying off because not everyone has enough oxygen to breathe. So too much or too little of this factor can actually be a negative thing. And then of course, light and temperature. This one is obvious. You have to have a certain amount of light. If you're a producer, you have to be in a certain temperature. I can't take an angelfish and throw it in the Arctic. I can't take an orca and throw it in the tropics. So these are things that are definitely going to be very specific to your type of species. So again, with temperature, temperatures of marine waters are capable of supporting life. Does not matter the temperature of the water, it can support marine life. So the coldest parts of the Arctic have fish in it, and starfish and a whole bunch of other different species. The hottest parts of the ocean, which are going to be again down by those hydrothermal vents, which can get over close to 800 degrees Fahrenheit, these places still have life. So yes, very, very cold, very, very hot, and right perfectly in the middle can also sustain life, but it has to be very specific to that species. Again, you can't take one out of cold water and put it into hot water. Every single fish out there, every single starfish, every single sea slug, it doesn't matter what it is, requires a very specific temperature for the water that they are in. A good example of this are my fish tanks over there. The turtles have a heater in their tank because their tank has to stay at 72. Cuddles has a heater in his tank because his tank has to stay at 82. And then the beta all the way at the end, they can pretty much live anywhere in between. So he doesn't even have to have a heater because room temperature is good for them. So this is because that, you know, Cuddles over there is considered a tropical fish. You find him a lot of the times in areas like rainforests. Those different types of fish are going to be in those river areas which are going to be a little hotter, hence 82. Whereas you have the turtles that tend to be a little bit colder areas, such as our springs, so they're closer to 72. So I can't take the turtles out of their tank and put it in there with Cuddles and expect them not to be uncomfortable, because they have very specific body mechanics for whatever temperature they are evolutionarily made for. Okay, so this brings us into evolution. I always get ahead of myself here. So evolution is something that we have all heard a million times. We've talked about it briefly at the beginning of the year in chapter 2, whenever we started talking about Darwin. We did our history chapter. And of course, this is something that you definitely should have talked about in biology. So every single one of Earth's organisms have changed or evolved over the course of 4 billion years. There's not one that is exactly the same. There's ones that are similar. For example, they talk about sharks and gators and all that sort of thing have not evolved a whole lot. They have very similar ancestors, but in some way there has been evolution. Now, evolution is typically going to occur through the process of natural selection. Again, these are very similar, very common terms that we should be familiar with. So natural selection is just going to be basically whatever animal is best suited for the environment is going to be the animal that survives. It's a pretty simple concept. So if I have a fish that is small, that is fast, that doesn't eat much, doesn't take much oxygen, and is well made for the environment it is in, it's probably going to survive, and it's probably going to reproduce. If you have an animal that is large, it requires a lot of oxygen, it doesn't get a lot of shelter in the area that it's in, then it's most likely going to die off, and it's going to have a hard time with its reproductive success. So the environment is going to favor the individuals that are obviously more well adapted, and those species are typically going to continue to adapt through their reproduction so that they continue to stay in the best possible form to be successful in that environment. Now, there are a couple exceptions to these rules. Random variations, we call these mutations. These are going to be things, I always think about albinism. So this is going to be, where you lose the lack of pigment in your skin, in your hair. So when you're an albino, and this happens to things that live in the ocean, fish, we've seen it in crocodiles, these are going to be mutations in the DNA that aren't necessarily hereditary, meaning they don't get it from their mother or father. It's just something has happened to cause this mutation. And it's not necessarily passed on, so they're not going to have this happen to their offspring. Now, this can cause some negatives sometimes. So you can imagine if the success of the animal is congruent with how well they hide, then probably being all white is not going to make them very successful in an environment. But in some areas, if it doesn't matter what color they are, if they're in a coral reef and they would have been a colorful animal anyways, then it may not affect them. Otherwise, all of their traits that they're going to get, all of those adaptations are going to be inheritable, meaning coming from mother and father, whatever it happens to be. And this is going to determine how they evolve. All those adaptations that they get, are they going to, the stronger ones tend to reproduce together. A lot of the times in these nature documentaries, you see the male putting on a show and the female picking the best one, because eventually when they mate, that's going to make an even better offspring, and it's going to continue. So like the cuttlefish is a good example. The cuttlefish, the biggest male shows off its colors, and the females will all gather around whichever one's the biggest, because then the biggest is going to help them produce the biggest offspring, which have a better chance of surviving. So it makes sense. And this is going to continue to create that reproductive success from those inheritable adaptations. Now, an example of how this can also be negative is when you have a species that is reproductively isolated. So when we think back to the map test we took at the beginning of the year, we labeled a couple of seas around the world that were actually landlocked, meaning they weren't connected to the Atlantic, to the Pacific. They're in the middle of a piece of land, and there's nowhere else for them to get out. Now, because of this, the species that are in these areas don't have the capabilities to mate with other similar species that their DNA matches with. And so they're not able to continue on those adaptations, because essentially at some point they're going to start to mate with family. because they don't have any new introduction. So those adaptations and those inheritable traits are really just going to kind of stop. They're going to stop evolving eventually because there's no new traits rather than mutations that are going to be introduced to that area because they are literally isolated. Now, this is going to bring us to convergent evolution. So when you have animals that do have that ability to move around and they can change and have those variations and have those different inheritable traits and adaptations, of course, they're going to start to take on traits and evolutionarily evolve into more successful animals, in theory. Now, these organisms can have nothing to do with each other, and they'll still produce similar traits because they're all evolving for the same environment. So this is, again, a good example of this. So this is a shark. This is a ichthyosaur, which is basically a old version of the dolphin. It's actually a reptile. Of course, this is something that no longer exists. There's a penguin, which is a bird, of course, and then there's a dolphin, which is mammals. So you have shark, which is a fish, ichthyosaur, which is a reptile, penguin, which is a bird, and a dolphin, which is a mammal. These animals have nothing to do with each other. They do not mate. They do not work together in any type of form. They are not procreating. So why then have all these animals come to have a very similar body shape? That's because each one of these animals is successful in their environment and have continued to evolve to be successful in their environment. And with them being all in the same environment, in this case, the ocean, they all take on that very similar fusiform is what it's called, body shape. So they are going to be more dynamic in the water. They can move quicker. They can have a lot less drag. They're going to be better swimmers, even the birds, which is going to be an unusual thing for a bird species. The mammals, of course, we watched the video on the whale evolution, how it was ocean to land, then evolved back into ocean, and that evolutionary process there. So even though they're very different animals, evolution has kind of converged how they have developed millions and millions of years, so that even though they're in very different kingdoms, they're all going to be very, very similar, all because of the environment they're coming from. Now, in talking about kingdoms, this kind of brings us into evolutionary heritage. Now, this is going to take us into taxonomy. So taxonomy, again, should be a familiar word from biology. This is going to be what we use to biologically classify different living things. Linnaeus, we talked about again in our history chapter at the very beginning of the year, was the first one to actually create the system of natural classification. Now, his was very, very simple, but it was a good stepping stone for scientists, obviously, to modernize it as time went on. So he developed a system, which we still use today, that's based on hierarchy. So he invented the initial first three kingdoms, which were animal, vegetable, and mineral. Again, very, very simple. Today's biologists have broken the living kingdoms down, mostly into eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. And then they, of course, we've broken them down further and further and further. This is very much, dogs and people are both considered animals in Linnaeus's taxonomy. Of course, we know that there's a lot more steps to that because we are not so closely related to dogs, but you get the point. So this is going to be how we started and how we finish, even to this day, still classifying our living things into kingdoms based on that system of hierarchy, because again, you have all those animals that look similar, the shark, the penguin, the dinosaur, and the mammal. And of course, even though they are all considered animals, they have very distinct DNA that is broken down into our biological classification as to what can actually mate to evolve further. And last but not least, this one kind of is a little random, but I'm just throwing it in there. So of course, with evolution, there are going to be some things that aren't necessarily biological that can affect evolution. The biggest proponent of this is going to be some type of catastrophic events, kind of rapid, violent change that can cause a lot of animals to die off. and cause a lot of animals to have to very rapidly meet those evolutionary rebounds in order to continue to survive. So a good example of this is going to be massive volcanic eruptions, global warming, asteroid impacts. So these are all things that can very, very quickly affect our oceans specifically, and a lot of the animals will die from it. For example, this is actually an asteroid that's in space. It's not heading towards us or anything crazy, but if this one were to hit us, it would go all the way from Washington, D.C. to New York City. That's a big impact, and that would cause a ton of destruction around the world, cause a lot of changes in the ocean. If we had the volcanic eruptions that we had the last time we had tectonic plates split apart, whenever we lost Pangea, that killed off like 80% of the ocean. And what was left had to very seriously evolve pretty quickly in order to compensate for these radical changes. So these are going to be things that not just affect the Earth itself, but really cause evolution to go into hyperdrive in order to keep life occurring. All right, so that is your chapter 13, guys. I tried to keep it quick, so it was a long video. Now you are going to go ahead and get started on an assignment called predation versus starvation. This is a chart that is going into your journal. You are going to copy the chart down and fill it out completely. This is going to take you through an example of how some of that predation in an aquatic ecosystem is going to affect the evolution and the reproduction system of another animal in that system. And that kind of brings us into the food pyramid assignment you'll do later on in the week. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, you guys. And I miss you already. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful week.